Water, food, and some say social interactions are the fundamental provisions that every human must have for survival. Water is found in most places on Earth, and social interaction occurs whenever two or more people are in contact. But food is different. It doesn't come to us like water and human relationships do. It must be hunted, foraged, or cultivated and harvested. We must work to obtain food. It is also a fundamental part of our culture, of our heritage. In many respects, it defines who we are as a people and expresses our culture in physical ways. Given the importance of food for survival, it is essential to ask the most fundamental questions. Where does your food come from? How is your food grown? Is it safe to eat? How do you know? So long as food is available and affordable, why should you care? We need to understand how our food choices impact the environment, society, and the economy. These things taken together are understood to be the three pillars of sustainability. And these elements all come together in our food system, and how our food is grown, distributed, consumed, and its waste is disposed. Beyond the pastoral farm field, slick marketing campaigns, and the lure of fast food on demand, there's a story that has been lost. This story must be told because everyone must have clean, healthy food to survive. This story is about food, about how food was once grown, why it is rarely being grown that way today, and what was lost in that transition. I'm Dr. Z, and I'm here to tell some of that story. It's a journey that begins in just one backyard. Like most people in America today, I am descended from immigrants. Unlike most people, I was born in the rugged blufflands along the upper Mississippi River, a river rat, a child of the driftless area, which was settled by European immigrants in the 19th century. Among them was my grandfather. My grandfather Ferdinand was born in 1861, the same year that the American Civil War began, and a century before I was born. He lived in a small village overshadowed by the steep bluffs of the Mosel River Valley in western Germany. By the 1880s, my grandfather's family suddenly uprooted itself, abandoned the vines of its ancestors, and immigrated to the western frontier of the United States. In the late 1800s, Ferdinand homesteaded a piece of good farmland in northeastern Iowa. His wife Suzanne was a young woman whose parents had left their tiny Luxembourg villages for a new life in land they had never seen, traveling 4,000 miles away from everything they had ever known. Ferdinand and Suzanne would have 12 children and raise all of them in the house they built on that prairie. They, like their ancestors, became farmers, a tradition that reconnected them with their culture, their heritage, and the ancestors they left behind in the old country. In 1896, Ferdinand and Suzanne celebrated the birth of their first child, Elizabeth, followed by John in 1897. Aunt Elizabeth and my mother, the youngest of the family, were born 20 years apart. Besides the age differences, there were deep generational and cultural differences as well. Mom and our family lived in the city in a thoroughly modern way. But Elizabeth and John lived the same way people did in the old country. Visiting them was like spending time in another era, like stepping into a living history museum where you could see and feel how our ancestors had lived for an uncounted number of past generations. In contrast to John, who lived in a cabin in the country, Aunt Elizabeth married and settled down in a small Iowa town. Elizabeth's entire backyard was a garden. A kitchen garden, as it used to be called, because one could walk out the kitchen door and harvest the food that would be on the dining room table an hour later. Instead of grass, the backyard space was dedicated to a more valuable purpose: providing food that her and her family needed. I didn't realize it then, but in my Aunt Elizabeth's home, I was seeing into a way of life that had existed in my family and in most of the Western world for centuries. I was seeing into the old world. That way of living was about to change. In the first half of the 20th century, life was relatively quiet on the old family homestead. That tranquil life was overshadowed by 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Those wars exposed a serious weakness in the urban lifestyle, where residents were on life support with respect to their food supply. Urban residents are almost entirely dependent on resources that are brought in from outside their community. Once those external resources become threatened, so is their well-being. Governments in Canada, Australia, Europe, and the United States recognized this precarious situation and enacted campaigns during the World Wars to encourage people to grow food for themselves. By doing so, food shortages and price increases would be better managed. But these governments also recognized the relationship between commercial food production and essential resource consumption, especially energy resources. Small-scale and locally grown food requires much less energy and other resources than large-scale crop production and cross-country shipping. Government-encouraged food gardens began to flourish during World War I. These were called war gardens and were heavily encouraged as a way to support the war effort. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the start of World War I, declared that food will win the war. These gardens transitioned into relief gardens during the Great Depression, and later these again transitioned into the victory gardens of World War II. The role of small-scale and local food growing as a resource conservation strategy was most developed during the Victory Garden campaign of World War II. These were mostly urban community gardens and home food gardens that were encouraged. Not only did these gardens save precious limited resources, but they also encouraged healthy living, stronger family ties, and gave individuals a way to contribute to a noble national cause. The Victory Garden program was wildly successful. By 1944, the number had swelled to 20 million Victory Gardens, more than one garden for every 4 people in the United States that year. Victory Gardens produced between 8.2 and 9.1 million tons of produce, approximately 40 to 50% of the fresh produce grown in the United States that year. At the end of World War II, the country focused on burying its dead and moving beyond the terrible scars of the past decades. But the wars were a catalyst for innovation and mechanization far beyond anything the world had ever seen before. These two forces were harnessed to address a booming post-war population growth. The farm machinery of the past were quickly replaced by large equipment that were capable of unprecedented efficiency. These machines were unleashed on the last remaining parcels of native prairie in the United States Midwest. Prairie that was considered to be useless patches of wasted land. By World War II, most of the great North American prairie had been plowed under. With larger equipment, arsenals of chemical pesticides, and inorganic fertilizers, any available land was converted to dense, single-species, large-scale agriculture. The era of industrialized agriculture had begun. This was a new food system, one that had never existed before in human history. An experiment with a new food production and delivery system was begun. One with many benefits, but also far-reaching negative impacts that affect everyone, even in small-town neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. On a hot July morning in 1979, I arrived at the West Palm Beach, Florida train station. It had been a miserable 38-hour train ride from Chicago. I had never taken a long-distance train trip before and didn't know what to expect. For the first time in my life, I was alone, without parents, family, or friends. At 18 years old, I had left everyone and everything I had ever known to live in a place I had never been to before, much like my grandfather before me. In my pocket was a deck of cards my mother gave to me the morning I left home. Stricken with a progressively debilitating illness, she had tears in her eyes as she struggled to the dining room table to get a deck of cards we used to play together. She told me I would need them to pass the time on my train ride. They were my only companion on that trip to Florida, to my new world. It would be the last thing she would ever give to me. Later in life, I thought back on that day. Playing cards was a way for my mother and I to spend time together. Food gardening was too. But with the advent of electronic games and supermarkets, card games and home food gardens were beginning to fade into the past. As my aunts and uncles and parents grew sick and died, I saw something slip away as I watched helplessly from halfway across the continent. When the last of them were gone, the final threads that tethered me to the old world were broken. I mourned the loss of what they had known and how they had lived, and this made me feel empty.
Never will I forget my friends and family.
That deck of cards was a gift to me from my mom, as was the love of growing food. I still have that deck of cards. And throughout my entire life, I will always carry with me the love of growing food. In the 3 decades since I moved to South Florida, I lived in apartment buildings and townhomes in a dense urban setting with no green space. I only ate food that came from supermarkets, and not from family farms or my own backyard, which is how I was raised. At that time, transplants to South Florida celebrated the fact that they were living a life of leisure. Beaches, swimming pools, golf, shopping, parties, and landscapes that were perpetually green and sculpted. The idea of people growing food for themselves was, well, preposterous. For them, it was part of the past, a primitive practice, something relegated to those in the lower class. The idea of a food garden was so appalling that neighborhood homeowner associations banned the growing of anything in their communities except grass. And so went my life. But for me, this felt empty. I missed the delicious fruits and vegetables of my childhood, which had been replaced by supermarket produce that had all of the flavor and texture of wet cardboard. Besides the fresh, locally grown food, I missed doing things for myself and the feeling of accomplishment and independence that it brought to me. This life of leisure required me to depend on others for everything and pay someone else to do things I was once able to do for myself. And for that, I had to work longer hours to pay those people. Eventually, I went to college and established a career as an environmental scientist. I saw how profoundly humans have impacted the world around them, and how these impacts ultimately threaten the well-being of humans. I also learned about how these negative impacts are unequally felt, and how they span the seemingly unrelated dimensions of the environment, the economy, and society. And two, how we are only told of a fraction of these impacts. It is this perspective that radically changed the direction of my life and led me into my own backyard, where I unexpectedly found reconnection with the heritage and culture I had been severed from 3 decades earlier. A few years earlier, I had purchased a distressed house in metropolitan West Palm Beach, and interior renovations were nearing completion. Now, what to do with that exterior landscaping? The norm for this area was meticulously manicured lawns and cube-shaped hedges, things that my neighbors and my husband also expected. This seemed worlds away from the neglected backyard that sat in front of me. When thinking about covering the land with lawn, something deep inside of me hesitated. I already had a small vegetable garden, and it was only big enough to grow a few tomatoes, but not really large enough to supply me with much food. In the remaining backyard space, the weeds were relentless and were impossible to control. In fact, it seemed the only place the weeds were absent were in the vegetable garden. Then I jokingly thought, well, if I expanded the vegetable garden across the entire backyard, it would solve the weed problem. I literally chuckled out loud at the absurdity of this. But as that thought began to settle, it took hold. I recalled my Aunt Elizabeth. Her backyard was all food garden. In fact, before the 20th century, lots of people dedicated not just their backyards, but front yards to food growing as well. Could we do this again? Maybe this wasn't so absurd after all. I began to wonder, if I did plant all of my backyard in a food garden, how would it benefit me? My household? My community? Can these benefits be proven? I knew I could answer some of these questions just by keeping track of some simple information. I could measure how much I grew. I could track how much time I spent gardening. I could even add up how far food in my supermarket traveled from farm to my city. And that would tell me how much energy would be saved by growing food locally. And some other things could be learned as well. Science publications contain thousands of studies that describe the nutrient requirements of industrialized agricultural crops and how much commercial crop could be squeezed from an area of intensely planted farmland, and so on. But there were very few, if any, studies that addressed the same topics as related to urban agriculture and home food gardens. The reason is simple. University agriculture departments focused almost all of their research efforts on rural industrialized agriculture and ignore the urban agriculture that is growing around them in their own cities, neighborhoods, and backyards. In fact, this neglected area of agricultural studies is exactly what is needed. Rather than lawn, I chose to plant a garden that would answer some of these questions, one that measured the benefits a home food garden gives. And this made me feel very excited. For the first time in decades, I felt a connection to my food growing heritage returning.
Hi, my name's Dan. I'm from Woodstock, Illinois, and this is my humble little garden. About 6 years ago, we started having a garden. We didn't have anything over here. It all grew. First of all, it was over there with cucumbers and tomatoes in that small little area. And then it grew into this about 4 years ago. I started buying these above ground gardens. It was easier for me getting a little older. I don't want to bend down to weed. It started out with the one, and then we added all these others. Mom always had a garden. They were big on tomatoes. Always made their own sauerkraut. My great-grandmother and grandparents probably had a garden the size of this yard back in Milwaukee. Growing up as a kid, they canned everything. She made her own ketchup, tomato soup, sweet peppers, Hungarian peppers, pickles. Everything was canned. Let's see, what do we got? Peppers, Thai chilies, jalapeno. This is a cardinal sweet. And then Anaheims, and then lettuce and carrots. Tomatoes. Most of these I want to try to get for sauce, but we'll see. I like to eat tomatoes on sandwiches. These last two don't usually give up tomatoes until later in the year. They're mostly, when they do give them, they're a good 2 pounds. Those are a hybrid from my neighbor in Kenosha. In '98, I moved there, and he had been planting tomatoes all the time. And one year he gave me some, and we kept the seeds. And from the seeds, we've been growing them ever since. We got dill in anticipation of a bumper crop of cucumbers. This is the first year for onions, so we're going to see how that works out. We planted all the flowers in order to bring in bees. I enjoy it. It's a stress relief. I like to see the things grow. I like to compare from year to year how did this plant do versus that plant. We like to be the best looking yard in the neighborhood.
Home food gardens like those my aunt cultivated played an important role in not just providing food, but also in the household finances. If the homeowner chooses to grow food, the garden produces food which has economic value. The homegrown food increases the household wealth. The household saves money by not having to purchase that food. But that is not all. Home food gardens also increase something that social scientists call food sovereignty. What this means is that the household becomes less dependent on others to supply them with this basic necessity. The truth is that urban residents are on life support with respect to their food supply, and they have to pay someone else to grow it, transport it, and sell it to them. If there is a problem on the farm or in the supply chain, prices will go up and food will become less available, or in the worst case scenarios, food will not be available at all. If a homeowner chooses to install turf grass on all of their property, the land becomes a financial liability because the turf grass requires constant mowing and fertilizing. And in some cases, it also requires pesticide application and irrigation. According to HomeGuide.com, the average monthly lawn care cost is between $90 and $200 per month. When you consider the number of lawns in your neighborhood, in your city, and in the United States, these numbers become staggering. In 2005, a study conducted by NASA found that, at that time, the extent of lawn in the United States was 49,000 square miles, more than the combined land area of the states of Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, plus Washington, D.C. By 2016, the extent of lawn was estimated to be over 62,500 square miles, expanding its state footprint by the land area of Maryland. This stands in stark contrast to how people used their front and backyards a century earlier, when that land was viewed as a valuable asset that could provide fresh, high-quality produce to their home at very little cost. In fact, not only were backyards traditionally used to grow food, front yards were as well.
met about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, and at that time we both had completely different lives. I was a partner in an international PR firm. He was the owner of a large insurance agency here in Dubuque, Iowa. And we got together at a time in our lives when we were really kind of questioning whether or not that was something that we wanted to do for the rest of our lives. And the answer to that was a resounding no. I mean, corporate life is really great for filling your pocketbooks and not so great for filling your heart. And so we embarked on a plan, on a journey to figure out what our next chapter might be. And for both of us, the answer to that question was doing something that would give back to the community that we lived in, which was Dubuque, Iowa. We knew we wanted it to be a physical place, some place for somebody to come to. From that, we began looking for what that might be. One of our original ideas was to buy an old school here and turn it into artist work spaces, like co-op spaces, live work spaces. We actually ended up getting as far as putting an offer in on that school, and it fell through. So the universe was in our court on making that happen, because the next thing that happened is we found some old greenhouses that were for sale. As soon as we saw them, even though they were in complete and total disrepair, we knew that this was for us. It was a long process of figuring out and building, rebuilding these greenhouses. It took a lot of money and a lot of time. At this point in the game, left our corporate lives, and so we could have retired to Belize or some other warm climate, but instead we decided to invest that money in our community, and the result was Vivian Berkeley Farmstead. So we're located in the north end of Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque, Iowa is a city of about 65,000, 70,000 people in the northeast corner of the state, right on the Mississippi River. The north part of town is essentially considered the wrong side of the tracks. It is largely working class, and in the 1980s, this neighborhood became very rundown, was almost entirely rental units, very transient, not a lot of pride of ownership in the area. And it got a not great reputation. So it went from nice working class neighborhood to not a really great place to live. And that was of vital importance to us when we started this project, was to do whatever we were going to do. We wanted to do it in a place that we could help breathe some life into. So between the time when we bought the property and when we opened in 2017, we had 2 or 3 growing seasons in there. And we began growing vegetables on the property that we had. We're in a dense urban area. There's very little land per se. So we were doing this in between the building and the sidewalk, the curb strips, in the back of the building, and every little found space. We're growing vegetables. And at the same time, we were modeling techniques to be able to do this in a dense urban area. So other people were kind of learning from us and seeing us do this stuff. The idea was that we were going to grow as much of our own food as possible to use in our restaurant. And then anything extra we either give away or process into something else or whatever. But we quickly realized that growing in our small crevices wasn't going to give us what we needed. So there's a hair salon on the corner that's at the end of the block where we are, and it's in an old house. And this house has a backyard to it. So we thought, well, I wonder if they'd let us put a garden in that backyard. And so we knocked on the door of the hair salon and say, hey, we're the crazy neighbors down the street, and what would you think about us putting a garden in this backyard? And they said, great, we don't have to mow it. So our responsibility was to keep it looking nice. They could take what they wanted from it. We would be able to start growing more. Then that is what really started a big thing in this neighborhood. So the first thing that happened is about 7 other neighbors said, hey, can you do that in our yard? And so we chose the right yards to do that in. We have now about 5 or 6 auxiliary gardens throughout the neighborhood. So we have a total of about 13,000 square feet of actionable gardening space that we grow in. We currently produce between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds of vegetables a year. But the effect of that is much broader There's been many homes and families in the neighborhood that have installed gardens in their front yards, in their backyards, in straw bales, in raised bed gardens, in pots, and you can see it. It's all over the neighborhood, which decidedly was not here before that. We have about 30 chickens that we raise here, and there are a nice handful of people in the neighborhood who now also have chickens. So that's a very visible effect that we think that we're having in the neighborhood.
Vivium's philosophy, we focus on three aspects of food: on the production of food, on the preparation and preservation of food, and on the enjoyment of food. And as the farm manager, my job is to grow food and teach people how to grow food. I have three types of gardens. I have common beds, which are yellow beds. They're right along the sidewalk. And in the common beds, the vegetables are available for the general public to help themselves to. The second type of gardens are demonstration gardens. In the demonstration gardens, I try to grow in a way that might not be very common here in Iowa. And then the third type of gardens, after common beds and demonstration beds, are production gardens. The vegetables that we grow here get taken into the restaurant. Previously, our mission statement had been to build communities around food, and that's still our goal. We kind of shifted our mission statement to improve life through food, and COVID really helped us understand how many people there are around us that needed food. Not just like fresh food and available homegrown food and organic food, not just that, because that's where the majority of my thought was, but instead just simple food.
Part of our initial vision for Convivium wasn't simply to grow food and give people food or have our food be in our restaurant. It was also largely based in education. In fact, we are a nonprofit, and our nonprofit status is granted based on the idea that we're an educational institution. So we teach people about food as well. We have a large curriculum that we teach here. We like to think we take the entire food cycle from seed starts to composting, and we teach everything in there. So we do garden planning, we do how to prune your tomatoes, how to plan your garden, where to get your seeds, potato tower building, composting classes, how to make jams and jellies, scone making class, sheet pan dinner cooking, knife skills. That was part of our initial vision. And the small little blip during COVID, we're back on track with that now. One of our big pivots that happened during COVID was, of course, we planted our gardens that year thinking, this is gonna blow over like everyone else did. And of course it didn't. So we chose to close the restaurant during that time completely. So late summer, we had about our 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of stuff coming in and no place to put it. So we decided, okay, well, this is also a time in our community and throughout the nation where food insecurity was really becoming more evident. I think it was always there, but it was very, very evident, particularly in the neighborhood that we're in. So we got a small seed grant from the city, and we used that to transform all of those vegetables into healthy casseroles that we just started giving away to people who needed it. We started with doing 100 a week, and then that program evolved significantly through donations and through a vast amount of volunteer labor to where we are now, 2.5 years later. We're giving away about 225 casseroles every week, and to date it's been something like 25,000 casseroles that we've given away for free to people in need in our community. Those casseroles are going to households. Those households have a combined household income of under $25,000 a year. Many of them have somebody on disability in the household. Most of them are over the age of 65, and it is really filling a big need in the community. We are providing so much more than carrots. And I never, ever, ever envisioned that we would have this impact on people's lives, but it's what happens when we have an idea and you launch it into the universe and just kind of allow things to happen. Another thing that happens quite frequently here is kids ride around on their bikes here. It's kind of like the old days when kids rode around on their bikes. And AJ, who's always out and about, just began engaging with all of these kids and saying, hey, you want a green bean? You want a piece of broccoli? You want to try this radish? We have radish eating contests so you can eat the hottest radish or the hottest pepper or, whatever it is. So that has really raised awareness about fresh vegetables. I mean, you get lots and lots of people saying, you can just eat that broccoli. Yeah, that's what it is. Just eat the piece of broccoli. You can eat it right off the plant. It doesn't have to come out of a plastic wrapped package. AJ is fond of saying, hey, think about this. These kids are growing up with vegetables all around them. It's normal for them to see tomato plants and carrots and green beans, and it's normal. And many kids in more affluent parts of town or parts of the world don't have that as a normal experience. So in many ways, it's a very rich experience for these kids. From everybody's spreadsheet and everybody's financial advisor advice and all of that, it was not a smart move. From a social contribution, from a place of heart and care for the world and the universe, was exactly the right thing to do. And that I think is what's different about us, and I think people feel that when they come and visit us here.
In 2009, I decided to turn my weedy backyard into a garden that would provide me with most or all of the fruits and vegetables my household would need. Much like my ancestors before me had done, a backyard dedicated not to turf grass, but to food production. So I grabbed my shovel and rake and began to work. I delineated garden beds with reclaimed materials. I enriched the soil with compost and mulch, determined to use only sustainable and organic methods. My husband watched from the windows of our house. The neighbors peered over the fence nervously. both realizing that the much-awaited lawn would not be coming. When the weather was right, I began to plant the seeds, and I watered and waited. The transformation happened faster than I had expected. So great was the change from gray to green that it was clearly visible from aircraft flying over my city. It was clear that something different and something exciting was happening in this backyard, and it was unlike anything else in the area. What would have been a monotonous expanse of grass was instead a place with a purpose. The garden was not confined to the ground. I also planted on the back wall of my house, in rows of hanging window boxes that provided another 50 square feet of growing space. These produced squash, spinach, beets, basil, radicchio, leaf lettuces, and so much more. Fresh food for my meals was harvested minutes before serving. The first year of the garden was 2010, and that season was about learning. Though I grew up with home gardens, and my mom was born on a farm, I still needed to learn how to grow food. Anything I had been taught by my parents had been forgotten during 3 decades of urban living and separation from my food-growing heritage. And this wasn't only me. One study of urban residents found that children who grew up with a food garden were almost 1/3 more likely to grow food for themselves, in spite of the fact that they lived in cities where food growing space was limited and supermarket produce was easily accessible. Unfortunately, this effect diminished with generational distance. This finding shows just how quickly generational food growing knowledge is lost, and how very important it is for parents to teach these skills to their children. It also explains why urban residents have been increasingly incapable of producing food for themselves, and how precarious and unsustainable this situation is. As I began to relearn how to grow food, that fragile and weakened thread that bound me to my ancestral culture was nourished and strengthened. I felt the broken connections with my lost heritage and my ancestors who had passed away long ago reconnect. Their voices and experiences echoed in my mind as I selected seeds to grow. I heard my Uncle John's voice as I planted potatoes, and my Aunt Elizabeth's voice as I harvested and preserved the food I grew, and my dad's voice as I worked the soil. And I saw my mom in the flowers I planted amongst the vegetables, flowers that were her favorites to grow in her garden, and that drew the pollinators that made my plants bear the food I ate. In 2011, the second year of my garden, I was feeling more confident, and the garden was remarkable. But the garden wasn't the only thing that flourished. I found pride in what I had produced and felt a sense of self-sufficiency. I began eating a much wider variety of produce than I would have ever purchased at a grocery store. And there was joy in trying new things, such as sorghum, which I grew and milled into a gluten-free baking flour, made the cane juice into natural syrup, boiled the seeds for a hot breakfast cereal, and popped the seeds like popcorn. The garden inspired me to cook more for my family than I otherwise would have, greatly improving my diet and those in my household. People came to see the garden, having heard about it through word of mouth. For those who came, it brought back memories of vegetable gardens they used to have and that they missed. For others, spending time in the garden was special because it brought back memories of loved ones who used to have big gardens, like a favorite relative or a grandparent that they visited as a child. Several visitors were drawn by the desire to have healthy food and to be reassured that their food was safe. Some brought their children, who had never seen a food garden before, or the plants that bore the fruits and vegetables they had been eating their entire lives. There were as many reasons to see the garden as there were people who came, but all were motivated by a hunger to see it and touch it in a personal way. However, the biggest surprise was not the people who came to see the garden. It was the other visitors, those who came unexpectedly. As part of my garden design, I included a patch that I referred to as my prairie garden. Here I gathered together a permanent collection of plants that attract pollinators and other wildlife. It was indeed beautiful, but it was also utilitarian. I needed those pollinators to produce some of my vegetables, to fertilize the flowers of my food plants. With the red carpet rolled out for the pollinators, so came those who dined on them. Like the tree frogs, they took up residence in the prairie garden and also in the window boxes on the back wall of the house. The birds came too. Some birds came not only to feed, but to roost and nest among the food plants, the safest place being the containers on the back wall of the house. There were other birds too, the migratory birds. They came for only part of the year and sometimes only used the garden as a rest stop. My favorite were the cedar waxwings, a bird I once knew from my homeland in the upper Midwest, a place I dearly missed. I envied these birds because they were able to spend time in the place that I could only long for, and hopefully one day return to.
My name is Renee.
My name is Sean White, Zion, Illinois. I've been coming to this barbershop since 1988. Moved here in 87. I joined the local church, and Elder Whitehead was there at the church, and he had a barbershop, needed a haircut. My dad brought me here, and it didn't look like this. It looked better than this. You know, he had a pool table back there. He had a jukebox, and as a young boy, and I'm seeing all this action going on, that I wanted to be a part of it and gravitate to her, but he always had the garden. And Renee doesn't give herself a lot of credit, and she's being modest, but that garden represents more than what it is. You know, it's for the community, but it's also for us, everyone here, and how it keeps Elder Whitehead, or Dad, how they call him Dad, I call him Elder Whitehead, his legacy alive. And so when I see that garden there, it reminds me of Elder Whitehead. And if he wasn't in this chair cutting, he was back there doing something with a hoe or rake or keeping himself busy. And like I said, I got married in a garden, and Elder Whitehead married me in a garden. So this garden has more than just attachment to being back of a barbershop. It just brings it all together.
All I can do is say that I was blessed to have the father that I had, and blessed to have my mind come and said, let me come cut here. And I just told my mother, I'm going to start working with my dad. So I went to barber school, And then I just started working here with them. Now, it wasn't easy at first because men, this is a man's world. Yeah, like, and they were like,
Yes.
a female could be a barber. You grow.
You were only allowed to be a hairdresser, right?
Yeah, you couldn't touch guys' hair. No, I'm not going to let a female cut my hair. My dad used to say, give her a try, give her a try. Now their wives will say, go see Renee. So, so that's a good thing. Dad put the garden in for, like I said, to keep himself busy. And he always, when he was growing up, he was with the 4-H club. So all his life he was working a garden. So that's why he started doing that. And it's just like they have it now. It's more of it was a community. If you wanted something, you just come, you would ask him and you come and go back there and get whatever you wanted. If you just wanted to talk, my dad would sit you on the bench and you can talk to him about anything. He didn't judge anybody. He just would talk to you and give you his advice.
My name is Barbara Young. I'm from the South Side, grew up here. And I just want to say thank you to Miss Renee Whitehead for allowing us to help in rebuilding what Mr. Earl Whitehead started. It's a privilege and an honor to be allowed to come and build upon a foundation that helps so many young men and women in our neighborhood grow up and to be successful. And so we have so many others and so many young guys that would come here, as she stated, with issues, and he would mentor them, talk with them, have them to iron out their differences. And the younger generation, they need it. They need it. And just, we think about homelessness. We think about how many people he helped that were homeless.
Right.
We think about the people that were hungry, and as she said, could go to the garden, get whatever you needed. And it just reminds us of how important the elders were then and how important they are now.
I started cutting hair here as a licensed barber in this chair, and so he nurtured me to be the place where I'm at now, and I'm standing on his shoulders of what he's allowed me to take place. And this young woman right here had a lot to do with it too. This young man over there had a lot to do with, like, I was slow. They used to ring a bell, Sean, let him go, let him go. But that's how slow of a barber I was. But think of a garden. Garden things grow slow. And when it grows and it starts blossoming, but Renee and Joe and all this is a part because this young lady, kept doing what she was doing here, breaking barriers and doing that. Well, I would not be here if it wasn't for the environment that Elder Whitehead and Renee and Joe created here as a family, as she said. And that's all I have to say, but it's more than just a community garden, it's a family garden. So when you come through here, you become family, and then when you're welcome in here, you're welcome for a haircut, but you're also welcome to the garden. And I just want to have last word to Renee if she wants to say anything, because truly, she's keeping her dad's legacy alive, and I'm honored to be a part of this legacy and this journey that has happened. So as things grow and they wither, but they come back again and cycle again, as long as somebody's at the helm with the garden hoe and the rake and doing the extra work. And Renee has done that, Joe has done that, and other barbers that have been here have done that.
Time passed and opportunities came. I was fortunate to be able to apply for and be offered a job in the Chicago area. This was a step back home. Once there, my husband and I spent time searching for a permanent place to live. We found the perfect home in the downtown district of a suburban city. It also had a backyard that was somewhat smaller than the one I had in Florida. When we closed on the purchase of the property, I immediately began to think about removing all of the grass in the backyard and planting a food garden. Here, too, the expectation was to plant your entire backyard in turf grass. And some neighbors, along with my husband, expressed concern to me that I might do otherwise. Their concerns were warranted. As with my Florida garden, I planted a prairie patch with all native species. This was my pollinator garden. In the backyard itself, I planted several fruit trees and staked out vegetable beds in the remaining area. The backyard's turf grass was removed over a couple of years, and the area was prepared for growing. It was time to get busy. The garden grew profusely. The last harvest in October produced a cornucopia of fresh vegetables that lasted until Thanksgiving, when I was grateful for all the garden had given to me and my family. Surplus was canned and preserved to enjoy during the off-season. With the winter pause in gardening, I reviewed all of the information I had collected. And when the analysis was done, I had even more to be thankful for. According to publications by Emory University and the University of Michigan, the U.S. food supply is almost entirely dependent on non-renewable energy and accounts for approximately 1/5 of all fossil fuel consumed each year in the United States. Of that, about 20% of the fossil fuel consumed by our food system is used for growing the food itself. The remaining 80% is for processing, transport, packaging, preparation, and other related things. Some studies have found that the average distance between farm and consumer is 1,500 miles, a value I confirmed while keeping records of where fruits and vegetables in my local supermarkets came from. One fact to consider: 90% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the United States are grown in California and transported across the country. And that burns a staggering amount of fuel. My backyard food garden saved approximately 1 barrel of crude oil each year, the amount of energy saved by not transporting the food that I grew from another region of the continent to my grocery store. Imagine the fuel savings and reduction in carbon dioxide emissions if the 20 million victory gardens of World War II were replanted today. According to the United States Census Bureau, the U.S. population is estimated to grow by 9 million people by the year 2050. According to the United Nations, world population is expected to increase by 1.6 billion people over that same time. Where will the food come from to feed all of this new population? The general pattern of land use over the past century and a half has been the transformation of natural habitat to farmland. And it's not just in North America. The Amazon forests are falling to supply land for cattle ranching. Central American tropical forests are falling to the expansion of agricultural production. With so many new people expected to be born in the remaining years of this century, how does humanity address this issue?
Hi, my name is Patrick. I am an administrative assistant with Liberty Prairie, and I also help to manage our community garden out here. Liberty Prairie is a not-for-profit in Grays Lake, Illinois, and we focus on sustainable agriculture, education, and conservation, sort of at the urban edge. We're about halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. Liberty Prairie has been around since 1993, so we're in our 30th year of existence. And the community gardens, it is one of our longest running programs that we have here. Over 20 years now that we've been doing this on site. So Liberty Prairie was formed in 1993. It was a component of the Prairie Holdings Corporation, which was the development corporation that built up 660 acres of land. 100 acres is for the farm, which is Liberty Prairie's property. 550 acres are for a residential development based around conservation principles. We also have the Prairie Crossing Charter School on site here, the Agricultural Association on site, and then we have Village of Grays Lake has a park over on the far side of the property as well. We have folks from all over Lake County that come here to grow with us, and it's really a joy to watch them come out here because you've got generational families, you've got grandparents, you've got parents of small kids, and you'll see all three generations out here on the farm working a plot together. So one of the other fun things out here at the community gardens is getting to know all of the gardeners, and we have a lot of different interests and different personalities. This plot behind me right here, one of the fun things our gardener here is doing is that she is growing entirely from donated seeds, free plugs, volunteer sunflowers, and everything given to her or acquired without purchasing it. And so it's a really cool demonstration of how you can grow in a space on a budget. We have another gardener who is doing a flower garden this year in honor of a miscarriage of her daughter. And we're actually selling some of her flowers down in the farm store. We have a gardener that grows and gives all of his produce to a food pantry in Waukegan. The neighbors in the community garden out here with us at the community garden. Neighbors in the community subscribe to our community supported agriculture program. Neighbors in the community are donors to Liberty Prairie. They're volunteers with Liberty Prairie and have been for numbers of years, many of them. We try to manage these relationships as best we can so that there's a good neighborly working relationship between the homeowners and then the organization out here with Liberty Prairie.
Change is a fundamental part of life, and this fact has been blisteringly etched in my mind. The old homestead, the land that my mom and her immigrant father worked, is still there, but continually threatened by a sea of industrialized agriculture that surrounds it. The old cabin that my Uncle John lived in stood abandoned and lifeless until a tree fell and destroyed it this past summer. It lies there defeated and decaying, along with the simple lifestyle of his era. No trace of my Aunt Elizabeth's vibrant and productive food garden remains today. When she died, the house was sold and the new owners covered the backyard with turf grass. They had no idea of its legacy. Just before my move to the Midwest, the old oak tree in my Florida backyard, the one that hosted flocks of cedar waxwings and other migratory birds, was struck by lightning and died. I mourned its loss. After I sold the house, the new owners paved the entire backyard over. As with Aunt Elizabeth's backyard garden, no trace of mine remains today. But change is a fundamental part of life, and some changes have been promising. On the rocky bluffs overlooking the majestic Mississippi River, farmland that was once prairie is being restored back to prairie. The damaged soils are healing. Wildlife is returning. Polluted water is being cleansed, and polluted air is being filtered. These restored lands are where people come in all seasons of the year to be immersed in nature. They come for solitude. They come to explore. They come to hike. They come to build the strength of their bodies. They come to touch their roots, to connect with their own heritage, and to reconnect with the land. These intangible benefits are far more valuable than a few acres of corn. Not one person has gone hungry with the restoration of these lands. No one needs to. If we were to renew our commitment to urban agriculture, we could significantly reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and foreign energy imports, and significantly reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. If we were to divert just a small amount of our resources towards urban agriculture, as we did during the prior world wars and Great Depression, we could recover so much of what was lost while shrinking some of the biggest threats to humanity. For the most part, these threats are not from a few large sources. In fact, they all result from the combined contributions of millions and billions of very small actions by individuals, like you and me, and the choices we make. The only solution is to take away some of those contributions. Woodrow Wilson's proclamation that food will win the war is no less true today when we talk about the war on climate change, natural resource depletion, food shortages, and food insecurity. Yet, urban agriculture and home food gardens have been excluded from the list of potential solutions. How successful we will be at addressing these problems for our generation and those coming after us may well depend on what we do in our own backyards.
I know a place where I can be free and the cares of life won't find me. It's a secret place just beyond today, where the chains of doubt will fall away.